Hi, I'm attorney Bill Bronchick, and in this video, I'm going to reveal in detail the new Dodd-Frank regulations as they apply to real estate investors. Now, Dodd-Frank is a big, broad law. It applies to banks, it applies to mortgage brokers. So I'm only going to cover what relates to real estate investors specifically and how to comply or get around or bend around the rules that exist today. It's been in effect for a few years now. So if you've been doing this and you're not following the rules, just make sure you do it right from now on, okay? Now, I assume you may have watched my previous video on my website at legalwiz.com, which is the basics of the Dodd-Frank. If you haven't, I'm just going to assume that you haven't, and we'll go over some of the basics as well as the advanced stuff, too. Now, what does Dodd-Frank deal with? Dodd-Frank deals with the mechanics of owner financing transactions. Okay, so what does that mean? What it means is it covers transactionally what you can and can't do in an owner financing transaction as a real estate investor. It is a federal law, so it's pretty much the same in every state. The states do have a corollary to this called the SAFE, S-A-F-E Act, which deals with licensing and regulation of licensed mortgage loan originators, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And sometimes there's a little bit of conflict between the two rules, but the SAFE Act is a regulatory scheme in terms of licensing, whereas Dodd-Frank, the remedy's a little different. It's not like someone's going to knock on your door or bang your door down and arrest you for not complying with Dodd-Frank. What it does is it gives a civil remedy to someone you sell a house to sue you in the event that they feel you violated Dodd-Frank, or in the case that you go to foreclose them or kick them out of the house for non-payment, they can turn around and sue you civilly under the law. Okay? So it is applicable in a limited number of circumstances. And people got really bent out of shape when Dodd-Frank was proposed and said, that's it, that's the end of owner financing, that's the end of investing as a real estate investor. Everybody tends to get a little overblown when these new laws pass, but the reality is it's a very narrow place where it applies. So it doesn't apply to flipping houses or fixing and flipping or wholesaling. It doesn't apply to renting properties. What it applies specifically is when you are going to sell a property to a person or persons who are going to live in that house as a primary residence, and you're going to offer some sort of financing, either partial or full or a second or a first, or or even a wraparound or a contract for deed, land contract. Any type of financing where the buyer is going to live in the property as their primary residence, Dodd-Frank applies. So let's talk about all the things where it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply when you're buying, because you're not buying to live in it. You're buying as investment. So if you buy something from a seller, individual, with an owner carry, any variation, it doesn't apply. It only applies when you're selling. Lease with option, does it apply to that? Well, technically no, because a lease with an option is what it is. It's a lease with an option to purchase. Now, if you disguise a lease option, an owner financing transaction as a lease option, meaning 10 years, 20 years, declining balance, with $1 buyout at the end, it looks like an owner carry. It looks like a land contract, and thus it would be applicable. But your standard, typical, 1, 2, 3 year lease with option to purchase, where it's a fixed price and you take a little bit down and maybe give a little bit of rent credits. That type of thing is, so far, the government has not specified that would be within Dodd-Frank. So again, to review, it only applies when you are selling to an owner with financing and they're going to live there. If you sell to another investor, doesn't apply. If it's a commercial property, doesn't apply. When you're buying as an investor, doesn't apply. Okay? So now that you probably feel a lot better that there's a limited circumstance where this is going to apply. If you're not within an exemption, the first rule is that you must use a licensed mortgage loan originator. That's someone licensed by the state under the SAFE Act to originate the loan. What does originating mean? Well, basically it means they're going to prepare a lot of documents. They're going to qualify your buyer. They're going to probably charge some points and so forth and approve your buyer. okay, just like any other lender would. Okay. Now, if you're within some of the exemptions, then you don't need one. You don't need to use one. Now, before you get carried away and say, oh, God, I got to use a licensed mortgage loan originator, or you have to be one, get licensed, there's quite a few exceptions where you don't have to. So let's go first with the exemptions. The first one is at what's called the one free pass exemption. Okay. So obviously, they didn't want to restrict the individual who's, mom and pop are selling their home and are going to carry it or going to take back a note for a second to be, hassled with all this stuff. So, when does that exemption apply? It's very specific. You must be an individual seller as a natural person, not as a corporate entity, or an estate, someone who's died in their estate, or a trust, like a living trust. Now, I know those of you who are more advanced and know what a land trust is. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Does a land trust for every property fit you within that one deal exemption over and over? The answer is, I don't know. And my recommendation is don't be the test case. All right, so let's assume that that does not put you within the one deal exemption over and over again if you use a separate land trust for each property. I'm pretty darn sure when they say person, estate, or trust, they're referring to your estate planning, living trust, and selling a property. Okay? Now, within that exemption, now you don't have to use a licensed mortgage loan originator. Just a few small rules. Number one, it can't be a neg-am type of loan or a funky reverse mortgage or something like that. It's got to be a straightforward amortization. It doesn't have to be 30 years. It could be 15, 20, whatever, but it's got to be a regular type of owner carry. It can't have a balloon. And there's no real restriction on the interest rate and so forth, except that for the first 5 years of this loan, even under the one exemption rule, you must fix the interest rate. So you can have an adjustable rate note, but the first 5 years has to be fixed, and then after that you can adjust it. Okay. So, and the only other real deal with the one deal exemption would be that you have to make what they call a good faith attempt to qualify your buyer, which really means nothing. There's no specifics about that. So basically, if you're selling one house once a year, you're an individual. That means your wife or spouse or husband would be another individual. Your living trust presumably would be another individual. So you could probably use that exemption a few times a year. But if you are a corporate entity seller, like an LLC or corporation, it doesn't fit within the one deal exemption, even if it's your only deal. Okay, doesn't fit within the exemption. All right. So the next exemption, in addition to the one deal exemption, is what's called the 3-deal exemption, 3 deals per year. Now, in this case, you can be an LLC, corporation, individual, or trust. Okay, you don't need to use a licensed mortgage loan originator, but you have to qualify your buyer, and you have to prove and document their ability to repay the loan. Now, at first blush, everyone got all crazy about this, like, oh, I got to document all this. Well, why wouldn't you? I mean, why would you sell to someone with an owner carry that you haven't qualified? It's a little more specific than, than just saying, oh, you put $50,000 down so you're qualified. And then in the old days we would do that. If it's a $100,000 purchase and someone puts 50 down, well, they're qualified because they're not likely going to walk away from 50 grand. But you can't do that if the person has no tax returns, no provable source of income, no assets, no credit report, hasn't filed tax returns in 10 years. You can't take that person because you cannot document their ability to repay. Okay, so that type of extreme scenario, doesn't happen that often, but it's pretty much out the window. Okay. Now, next thing, no prepayment penalties. Okay, can't put a prepayment penalty in within the 3-deal exemption, and no balloon. This is a tough one. Okay, I'll admit this is a tough one because if you're selling with an owner carry, whether it be taking a second, a first and a second, or a wrap, you'd like to have a balloon there, to get paid off in a certain period of time. Under this new rule, within the 3-deal exemption, you cannot have a balloon. Now, practically, you might be able to get a balloon, and here's what I mean. let's say, and same thing about the interest rate has to be fixed for the first 5 years. Beyond that, you can raise the interest rate 2% per year for a total of 6% above the original rate. So if the original rate was 5, you can go up to 11, 2% per year. Okay? So if you started at 5% with your buyer and said, if you pay it off before 5 years, then we'll give you a discount on the balance. If you don't pay it off after 5 years, the rate jumps to 7, and then the next year jumps to 9, and then the next year jumps to 11. You're pretty sure that person's going to pay you off. Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait at least 5 years, but it's a carrot and a stick. Give them an incentive for paying off early, give them a penalty for, essentially for paying you off later. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you want to put a balloon, you can't technically, but you can sort of force the issue around the 5-year interest rate rule. Okay, now here's where it gets into the nitty-gritty. How do you qualify your buyer and what do you have to prove? Well, first of all, I would start with a regular standard Fannie Mae 1003 loan application. That's the standard in the industry. Okay, so make them fill out a 1003 or the equivalent, something that makes them state and eventually prove what their income is, what their assets are, what their other obligations are, and so on and so forth, and what they make relative to the payment. Now, the rules say you must at least consider 8 factors. Now, unfortunately, with the exception of one, as we'll discover in a moment, they don't tell you what those factors should be. They just say you have to consider them. So you have to have some documentation that shows you at least considered all 8 of the factors. Okay? So here it goes. The first one, that is their current or expected income. So you're probably going to have to get W-2s or 1099s, tax returns, etc. Okay, just like any lender would. Get those copies, put them in your file. All right? Number 2, their employment status. So if they're not working, it doesn't mean you can't take them. They may have another source of income, another way of making money. But if you get like bank statements or something like that, business or personal, that shows a reasonable amount of money going in and out each month, then you've at least considered it. There's no rule that says you have to take someone who is only employed. You can't take someone who's unemployed or self-employed or is a trust fund baby or et cetera, or receives alimony. There's no restriction on that. Okay. Number 3, what is the monthly payment on the new loan that you are offering this buyer/borrower, okay? And what's going to be the total amount of it, relative to his income, so to speak, okay? So can he afford the payment, basically? And again, you may not be able to do that with a W-2 or a tax return. You may be able to look, if the payment is $2,000 a month, for example, and they can show you 3 or 6 months bank statements that show 10 or 15,000 coming in and out of that bank account for the last 6 months, that's probably enough. I mean, I don't know if it has to be that much, but you can draw a reasonable conclusion that it could support a $2,000 a month mortgage payment. Okay. Number 4, we have to look at your monthly payment on other loans. So if they have a car loan or another house, a rental property or something like that, you have to consider those. That's other payment loans. Also, other obligations. So if they have child support, alimony, student loans, paying on a judgment, whatever, you have to consider all of those. Now, so far, no guidance at all from the government as to what those guidelines should be. Lenders have the very strict guidelines on all these things. It can't be more than this or less than that, but there's no place in Dodd-Frank that says it has to be X. It's up to you. Use your head. I mean, just use your head. Okay. Number 6, we have to look at other mortgages. I think I combined them before. I'm mistaken. I'm sorry. Other loans would be like car loans, student loans, other obligations like alimony and so forth, other mortgages as in they own another property or a rental or want something for their kids are living in or so forth, or a vacation home. So you have to consider those. Those are separate, even though they're sort of the same thing. Now here's the specific one. Debt to income ratio, DTI. Now you've probably heard that before. In the lending business, there's what's called a front end and back end ratio. It's the back end ratio we're talking about. This is the total monthly recurring obligations relative to the income that they take home. Okay. Now, the government says, specifically on this one, it must be no greater than 43%, meaning for every dollar that they take home in income, the payment on the mortgage and other monthly obligations and loans can't exceed 43% of that. Now, personally, I think that's a bit high. Personally, I think that is pretty high. I wouldn't even go that high, so I don't think that's a deal killer. I would probably only go 35, 40%, depending on what their credit or income looks like, because you have to consider the last thing, number 8, their credit history, which means you would have to pull their credit. Can't consider it if you haven't pulled it. Now, maybe they can go on freecreditreport.com and pull it themselves. That's probably sufficient if it's accurate. Okay, you have to at least consider their FICO score and their credit history. And again, there's no specific FICO score that's required. Just look at their history and use your head. Okay, and keep a copy of it in your file. So that's it. I mean, those are the 8 factors you have to consider. That means you want W-2s, 1099s, and or tax returns, verification of employment, what their monthly payment is going to be, and whether they can afford it, and maybe bank statements to support that, and then other loans or obligations or mortgages, a debt-to-income ratio of no more than 43%, but personally I wouldn't go above 35, 40, and what their credit is. Now, certain things you can use to prove these things other than what I've just mentioned. So, for example, let's say that you rented to them for a while, and they can afford $2,000 a month rent, and their mortgage payment is going to be $2,000. Well, they've already made it. They've already made the $2,000 a month for several years. Why can't they make it now? So that pretty much satisfies the monthly payment obligation and the income issue, because obviously if they have a history, then you've got something to document, and that will satisfy several of those factors, even though they don't traditionally fall inside the box, so to speak, with W-2s or tax returns. They have bank statements and they've got a rental history with you. That goes a long way. It definitely goes a long way. So what you might want to do is put someone on a lease with option for a year or two, and then convert it into an owner carry, and that way you have a better history to show if you ever got into litigation. Let's talk about that. So when is this going to come up? It's not, again, the government is not going to knock on your door and say, hey, are you using a licensed mortgage loan originator, or are you considering these 8 factors? What's going to happen is, more than likely, you're going to foreclose or throw out in some way a buyer who's defaulted, and then they're going to hire a lawyer and countersue you, and they get all their payments back plus penalties plus attorney's fees. So that's a big one. It could be pretty painful. Now, the statute of limitations is almost infinite in that regard, meaning 15 years in, you sue them, they can still countersue you there. Now, there's a shorter statute of limitations if they're not being sued, meaning they just went to a lawyer and just decided they think they were ripped off. Very unlikely going to happen. And they're probably thrilled and tickled that you sold them a house with an owner carry. So that's probably not going to happen. More likely as a defense. Now, let's look at the reality of this. If someone doesn't have money to pay you, where are they going to get money to pay a lawyer that knows this stuff? Because I can guarantee you, 99.9% of lawyers who know this stuff, and very few lawyers do, work on a contingency basis where they don't charge money up front, but they do a piece of the back end. Not going to find a lawyer who's going to do that. Unless you are a prolific seller. So if you own, let's say, a mobile home park and you're selling mobile homes, which would be under Dodd-Frank, owner carry, residences, even though they're not real estate, it's still under Dodd-Frank. Or you're a builder and you're owner carrying and you have big signs and TV ads and radio ads, that's something that a lawyer might go fishing for. If he found one person in his office that said, I was ripped off because of Dodd-Frank was violated, and he concludes that, well, he might go, putting out ads and saying, who else was ripped off by these people, and, get a class action going, in which you can be in big trouble for that if you're the person. But most of you, I imagine, 99% watching this video are not in that category. You're just going to do a couple of owner carries a year. You're within the 1 deal exemption. You're within the 3 deal exemption. Now, if you do this regularly and you're not an individual, then you're above 3 deals a year. Then you have to use a licensed mortgage loan originator to close each deal, which is not a big deal. I've done it before. Guy down the hall from me, mortgage guy, not super busy. I said, what would you charge to take a 1003, consider these factors, and pump out a bunch of disclosures on a typical loan, bunch of paper? And he said, $500. Fine. You charge the buyer $500 origination fee, and you're gold. That's easy. Now, on a mobile home, it's going to be a little tougher, because if you're selling a $5,000 mobile home on owner carry and it's going to cost $500 to originate it, that could be problematic. So if you're selling a lot of mobile homes, you might want to consider getting licensed yourself. It's not that difficult to get licensed. And you can buy the software or rent the software online to prepare all the documents and disclosures regarding loans. Okay? Let's see. What else? We talked about the rate being fixed for 5 years, and then you can go 2 points a year above that, up to 6% over the original loan. The rate on the loan itself cannot be more than 6.5% above the average prime rate. What does that mean? That means if typically in the market, people are paying 4% or 3% for loans, you can't charge your buyers more than 6.5% above what's that, average market rate. Okay? So probably not going to be a problem. I mean, if market rates are 3 or 4, you're not going to be charging 11%. You're probably going to be charging 6, 7, 8%. And most buyers are not going to pay 11% anyway. So that's probably not a problem. On a second mortgage, though, you're allowed to charge up to 8.5% above the average rate. So now we're talking, upwards of 12, which again, most buyers are not going to pay even on a second. But remember, if let's say for some oddball reason the average mortgage rate went down to 1, and you wanted to charge 10, which I just find no scenario where that's possible. But let's say theoretically you wanted to. As a second mortgage, you can go 8.5%, so up to 9.5% total, okay, above the 1. If it's a second mortgage, so if it's an owner carrying, you own it free and clear, put a loan on it and then wrap it. So it becomes a subordinate or second mortgage. If you don't understand what that means, I have videos on wraps and what that means, but just putting that idea in the back of your head. Okay? Now, the 3 deal per year or the 1 deal per year. Let's talk about affiliated entities. Okay? Because that's where everybody's trying to look in the, how can I expand this 3 deal a year thing without using a licensed mortgage loan originator? So if I have an LLC I own and I do 3 deals, and I own another LLC and I do 3 deals, are those counted as 3 all in one, or are they 2 separate legal entities? It's not clear yet. The law has not been really clarified in that regard. Obviously, if you own one and your wife owns another, I would be pretty confident of that one. Under the 1 deal a year rule, the land trust thing with 1 land trust per property, I don't feel very confident that that's a good argument. But on the 3 deal per year, I think there's a reasonably good argument that if you have one LLC owned by you, 1 owned by your wife, and 1 owned by your IRA, those are 3 separate taxpayers, and each would get 3 exemptions. Again, if you do this a lot, which is only a few of you watching, it's not that big of a deal to find a licensed mortgage loan originator who will do this all for you. It's not that big of a deal. Okay? If you have any follow-up questions on Dodd-Frank or how it works or what some of the rules and regulations are, please drop me an email, bill@bronchick.com, bill@bronchick.com. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope I've, not just confused you, you may be a little confused, but taken away some of the fear you may have had around Dodd-Frank and how it affects your life as a real estate investor. As you can see, most investors are not really affected by this much at all. Okay, and compliance is not all that difficult. If you're doing a lot of these and you need someone to help you comply with this and get your business company practices in order, so to speak, then definitely drop me an email. I'll see if I can help. Bill@bronchick.com. Thanks for watching.